I agree with everything Arham says. Yeah, I think it's really important to like communicate, especially if you're on your sub-I. I know at my medical school and probably at almost every other medical school, the expectation is at the end of a sub-I you get a recommendation letter. Um, that's like what you're there for. Sub-I is kind of like the final exam of medical school. And I think it's definitely a good idea at the very beginning, asking not only your attendings, but also your like senior residents. I want to honor this rotation. I'd like to know what I can do to do well and be helpful. And it's also reasonable to say, I'm hoping to get a letter of recommendation at the end of this rotation. What can I do to, do a good job? Blah, blah, blah. And then I agree that like asking kind of right at the end of your rotation when all of the information is kind of fresh in the letter writer's mind, as opposed to waiting like several months, um, or even like, a year and a half, when the letter writer might be like, oh, who was that guy again? What did he do again? What's memorable about that person? So they might not be able to write you a more a letter with like more specific information about you as a med student. They might have end up writing a more general letter if they only have general memories of you. um I'm gonna post one of my rotation kind of preceptors told me to use this template to request a letter over email, so I'm just gonna post that in the chat for you guys all to have. um and he was like, literally just send this. This works. Like I think some med student sent this to him, and so he was like, this is amazing. Just send this to your person. Um, yeah, I mean, you could do it over email. I always requested letters of recommendation over email because I felt like it doesn't put anybody on the spot and it doesn't put a lot of pressure on anyone if they do or don't want to write you a letter for whatever reason. Um, Recently, we had a session with Dr. Awan, who's the associate program director of the radiology program at Maryland, and he gave kind of the opposite advice, where he's like, you should ask in person because then you can gauge the potential letter writer's response. If they're very enthusiastic about writing you a letter versus if they're like, oh, let me think about it, right? You don't want to get a letter from someone who's like, oh, let me think about it. So I think there's pros and cons to either method. You could probably succeed either way.
Those are really good pieces of advice. Just adding to what Zaid and Arham said, just some specific things. One is like, yeah, like as Zaid's reply has in the comment, like ask for a strong letter. Don't just ask for any letter because all letters by default are going to say like, X and Y was an enthusiastic med student. So you want to ask for a strong letter specific. The second thing I would say is like, if you're able to just ask them, if you think you did really well, like one of the things that sounds really good in a rec letter is like, is when letter writer says like, I've worked with X many students over the past X years, and this student is in the top 10% or top 20% of students I've worked with. That stuff looks really good for evaluating students because, as I said, like every reg letter is going to sound somewhat good. And another thing for ERAS is that you can actually pick and choose which letters you send to which programs. So if you're applying to both academic and community programs, if you did a lot of wet lab research with someone, or like a really big name, like you work with someone, then those letters should go to the more academic programs. But if you did some volunteer work or like a community program, then maybe those can go to a program that's not as academically focused. And then also just adding on, like you can, every time I sent a regular, I would also always add like an extra document, not the CV, because like I sent the CV also, but I would send an extra file just with some bullet points of some things that were relevant for that, like that person. And I would kind of do different bullet points and different things for different letter writers. That way it would give like a broader perspective of who I was. So just some more specific things to focus on.
So
Yeah, and
I want to pretty much
sorry,
echo.
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's cutting someone off.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So I mean, it's echoing a lot of the same concepts that everyone has said on so far, with being prepared to ask for that letter of rec early. But maybe I can offer the perspective of someone who's a little bit more timid. And I took a big gap for research between my like third year standard clerkships and later on when I was applying for ERAS. So I didn't necessarily want to tell my third year family medicine rotation preceptor, hey, I'm going to ask you for a letter, because then I felt like when I ultimately don't, they're going to be sitting there saying like, hey, did you still want that letter? And then they almost feel like they have to bug you for it. So I did kind of take more so the approach of waiting for the big blocks until later on, when I knew like, okay, I know I'm going to want to ask somebody from internal medicine versus somebody from surgery, and not necessarily say it on day one, but definitely do say from day one, like, what are your expectations of somebody who would be not only successful in this block, but would exceed your expectations. And I think that'll set you up for success, and you can always go back and ask for a letter from somebody that you've bonded with. My second piece of advice is when you're doing your sub-Is, especially, it is understood that you will ask for a letter, but it may not always be understood that they will give you one. And I think phrasing it and asking, would you be comfortable writing a strong letter? Do you think you could write me a strong letter of rec? That phrase strong is really code for, are you going to write me a good letter? Because ERAS is going to make you check a waiver box that says that you did not read what your mentor wrote about you. So you might be able to pick and choose based on who was associated with what program, but you're not going to be able to say, oh, I know that my letter from so-and-so is strong, because you have no idea what they said. So using that phrasing is key number two. And then for those sub-Is where it is something that it's like, especially a competitive specialty, you do want to be able to get the expectation at the beginning, I would say within your first week of either meeting the program director or the chair or somebody in the department at those away rotations, especially, and say that you do want to make that performance. You do want to meet and exceed their expectations, and that you would hope that by the end of it, they'll know you well enough to write that letter. Check in again at the end of your month with them, and then be prepared at that point to give them either, actually, if you really want to like exceed a lot of people's expectations, be prepared to give them a printed copy of your CV. Some of them may ask for a draft of your personal statement. And then if you're emailing, to just kind of touch base, I haven't read the whole text message, but I would say too, like, that's a good place to include something really specific about you, to remind them, like, I really loved when we were working on this case and you taught me this. And then that'll really help them remember who you are, what you gleaned out of the rotation with them, and that you're like actively learning, rather than just, hey, I'm Nadia and you worked with 5,000 people this year. Hopefully you'll remember me. Okay, thanks. Sorry, long answer.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you everyone for answering those questions. Me as a fourth year, I think all of that was super helpful. For the next question, kind of switching gears to the personal statement. A common question that we got in terms of personal statement is any general advice that the panelists would have, and then also, are there any general do's and don'ts for personal statements?
I'll go first. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Nadia. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. I cut you off.
No. You let me go last time. You go, please.
All right, I'll go. Thank you. So actually, I used to help people write personal statements for my school for the last little while. The advice I usually give, and again, feel free to disagree if you guys think so, but just a little bit of background from my side. So I'm coming from a Caribbean med school, so I'm an IMG. Most of the people that I help out usually have some sort of chip on their shoulder, and that's to be taken into account. I'm not sure if a lot of the audience has similar background or not, but if that's the case, you know, people might be coming from that similar background might be a little bit more anxious, and then there's just kind of getting over those nerves a little bit, so people kind of do a little bit more. Piece of advice I got in med school, when I was in med school, about writing your personal statement, which I don't think I 100% agree with, was go the safest route. What's the best flavor of ice cream is what they asked, and everybody said their own, and the answer was always wrong until someone said vanilla. because everybody likes vanilla, right? So I mean, it kind of makes sense. I don't 100% agree with that piece of advice, because if you like chocolate, you like chocolate. You got to be genuine to yourself, right? And that's what the personal statement is. It's a glimpse of who you are as a person. You can, like, a lot of people kind of spend a lot of time thinking, okay, what is the program looking for? What is the program director looking for? At the end, it doesn't matter what they're looking for. It matters who you are, and that's what you're trying to portray through this personal statement. If you can do that and you happen to match what that person is looking for, then inshallah you'll match there, and that's the end of that, right? But in terms of trying to cater to what somebody else is looking for, I wouldn't really recommend that, because then you're not being true to yourself, and people end up sometimes making stuff up or etc. And that's obviously not a good thing to do. As far as practical advice goes on that, a really basic kind of structure to follow, or blueprint to follow for personal statements. Again, guys, feel free to, like, jump in and say your own, but a really basic, if you don't like have your own kind of way to go about it, is why medicine, your journey to medicine, why this specialty specifically, and why should this program pick you over the other guy, right? So the next candidate, and you want to kind of sell yourself in that way. Why, like, okay, yes, show your background, show your story, show your genuine interest in medicine, in that field, and then kind of give a little bit of, okay, this is what I bring to the table. Yeah, that would be my little piece of advice.
I really agree with all of that. For sure, the bare minimum is that you can articulate why you're interested in the field, as far as the why your specialty and why medicine. If you can elaborate a sentence or two on what you've contributed to the field through either service or research, or just even if it's like, I rotated through blah 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 many centers or away rotations or whatever, and I got this experience. That'll show a little bit of dedication and that you're really invested, because the last thing they want is somebody who is kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out the door, and then they're going to end up transferring residency next year or whatever after they've already given you a spot. And then I agree with kind of keeping your own flavor of the ice cream. Don't be too political and say anything inflammatory, but definitely be true to who you are, because even if you tone it down and you end up matching somewhere that they thought they liked you, you might just be miserable because you're hiding who you really were.
Yeah.
Oh, one more piece. Sorry. Get as many eyes on it as you can. Like, send it to your friends, send it to your mentors, send it to your home program director, because they're rooting for you. Like, they're in your corner to get you matched. The more people that see it, the more nuanced things can kind of get cleared up. Awkward phrasing of words can be eliminated, and then they might even give you some perspective that you thought you didn't want to talk about, and then they tell you, no, like, trust me, it'll be really good. They've seen way more personal statements than we have, than you have, than whatever. Let them give you their advice. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so one thing that's kind of unique about personal statements for residency is that you can write specific personal statements to specific programs. And that wasn't the case necessarily when you applied to like colleges or med schools. And so if you, for example, like I was at University of Maryland and I needed to kind of convince like California and Texas programs why I would be willing to move there. And so I actually like, I had my general personal statement, right? But then I kept some space at the end for a little blurb. It's like, and I'd love to continue my journey at this institution. And then I would talk about like my personal factors, like, oh, like my wife's family is in Dallas. And so this would be an excellent place for me to train and have a good support system. Or like my wife and I would both have great career opportunities in the Bay Area. And so this would be a great place for me to train. And so you can add that specific thing to kind of like convince programs that you'd be willing to go there, especially if it's like, oh, I was born in New York, I went to undergrad in New York, I went to med school in New York, like California or Texas schools, like this guy's gonna stay in New York. Like why would they leave? So why would we waste the interview spot on this person? But if you can kind of like, give a blurb and explain why you're interested in a specific program or a specific area. And it doesn't even have to be personal. You can say like, I'm specifically interested in AI research, and given that Dr. So-and-so is one of the leading people in the field, I'd love to like work with them or work at this like institute at your, program. And so like basically like giving more specific factors for why you want to go to a particular place. Now, I think the most important thing for personal statements, more than anything else, is they cannot have any like grammar mistakes or like typos, right? Like that's just like really, really bad because you have a lot of time to work on it, and most people have a lot of people looking at it. And so if you have a typo, it kind of comes off as like you're careless, especially in like radiology where like all we do is like put out reports and our words are everything. If you like, you don't want a resident who's gonna like, if you're careless in your personal statement, you're gonna be careless in all of your reports, right? And so that's a really big deal. I almost I did the thing where I made specific statements for specific programs. I caught myself at the last minute. I almost said George Washington University in my personal statement for Georgetown. So like that's an example of something you absolutely cannot do, right? These like typos, these errors, they can be fatal. And you can have a beautiful statement, but like these grammar things, these typos can kill you. Other than that, like yeah, if a radiology applicant was asking me, I'd say, why radiology? Why are you going to be a good radiologist? What experiences have led you here? What's your journey? Maybe include your future plans and put that into a narrative and put it out there. Doesn't have to be vanilla, but if there's something like unique about you, about your application, about your journey, I would throw that in there. If there's nothing unique and you're a vanilla person, then like just be vanilla and just like state what it is. State your journey, state what you're about.
Yeah, it's all really good advice. Just to add on to that in terms of the customizing. So yeah, make sure that it's the right personal statement going to the right program. If you're going to do a lot of them, you can make different folders in your computer just to make sure you stay on task and not mixing them up. And then also, I think like when people apply to med school, they spend a lot of time on the personal anecdotes and patient stories. Those are still great for residency, but just try to make sure it's not too much fluff and try to really focus on like how that patient anecdote really contributed to your understanding of the field or what you actually did for the patient. Those are some things I'd like to add. And Murtaza, if you want to add anything as well.
Can I add a couple things actually? Speaking of AI Zaid, please don't use Chat GPT to write your personal statement as much as you might be tempted. It's going to come out very generic, and there's a lot of tells that this is AI generated, even without having to run it through like a checker or something. So I strongly advise against that. You can use it to kind of check your work and use it to give you prompts and stuff, but please don't use it to write. It becomes very obvious. I've read a lot of personal statements, and literally they all end up sounding the same when they're coming from the same thing. So it's going to be very obvious. Please stay away from that. Another thing that Nadia mentioned, like show it to everybody. I definitely agree. Show it to non-medical people too, right? Show it to non-medical people to get completely fresh eyes on it. They can give you some perspectives that medical people might not even think about. So it's good to just even show it to like your siblings or whoever else that you know might be a good writer, and they can give you some feedback. Out of all the personal statements I've read for people, the ones that stick out the most are the ones that kind of flow like a story, and they have some sort of narrative to it. So if you can kind of bring that element to your personal statement, then it becomes more memorable. But that's okay. Not everybody is able to reach that point. That's okay. Like a good personal statement doesn't have to be super narrative. It could just or I mean super like in a way of storytelling. It could just be like Mokas and Zaid were saying. It could just be basic information about you, and that's usually good enough as well.
Murtaza, what's the tea? Spill the tea. We need to know.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, I think covered everything. Just, I guess, if you're applying to like a residency or like a program that's a bit more like not IM, like for example, like surgery and you plan to do gen surge. I think if you can try to talk about where you want to be in 10 years, I think that goes pretty far. For me in IM, I couldn't really do that because I wanted to do hemonc and I didn't want to focus it all on hemonc, but it kind of is more applicable when you're applying to fellowship. But still, if you can try to mention if you want to do academics, what you want to do, what kind of stuff you want to focus on, gives them a better understanding of how they can help you in residency and if you'd be a suitable candidate later down the line.
So yeah, thanks everyone for all those answers. Super helpful. I think to make sure we have time for everyone's Q&A questions, we can go ahead and move into that portion of the event. And so we'll stop the recording at this point, so you guys can feel free to ask whatever's